So a couple of days ago, we were talking about something called the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I personally think that that is not really a great argument, or more specifically, not something to be used against argumentations. And so I think for this particular episode of The Good, the Bad, and the Huh, I kind of want to explain from a non-theist position to both theist and non-theist why that probably shouldn't be used as often as some kind of automatic by fiat dismissal of any kind of claims. And a couple of different reasons of why people do think that it's an aphorism that's overly used, but still has maybe some underlying themes that I think people can draw from. And that's what I kind of want to talk to Fuzz about today.
Yeah, Steve, from my perspective as a Christian theist who will make arguments for God's existence, engaging, non-theists, oftentimes when, I present a case, usually the rebuttal is, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the argument is just completely dismissed, completely sidestepped with that particular tactic.
Yeah, it's an evasion technique. Now, the particular aphorism, it was made famous by Carl Sagan, as people know. He wasn't really the first one to come up with it. There was a person from the CSI COP, I believe his name was Tuzizi, is that how you pronounce it, if I'm not mistaken? And before that, I think even Leibniz had kind of had a very similar aphorism. But it's kind of a heuristic approach to how we accept certain claims. And one of the things that's primarily based upon it was called the law of parsimony, or law of parsimony, which is kind of colloquially known as Occam's razor, where the simplest explanation is usually the best one to go with, assuming that they both have the same kind of predictive and explanatory power for the most part. And so when we're looking at something like the evidence for like a God or some kind of what people call extraordinary, the problems that I have with it is that it's twofold. One, you're introducing an objective measure, a subjective measure into science when science is supposed to be objective. If I do an experiment and I get a certain result, you as a scientist should be able to do the same experiment and get the same result, regardless of where we're at, regardless of any time period changes. It should be the same expected results. That is not open to interpretation and subjectivity. That is an objective measure. And so when we're talking about extraordinary claims, there's an introduction of subjectivity. That what do we mean by extraordinary? Yeah. And the only way I can think that we could possibly relate it to anything of why we expect certain evidence to exist and to be changing our belief is that it has to overcome what was called low priors that we have not seen. For example, if Fuzz says to me, "Hey, Steve, I bought a dog," the evidence for that is all he has to do is show me a dog, right? And I'll probably believe him, right? I also have a rapport with him, so I don't doubt him anyways, right? But if he says, "Hey, Steve, I've talked to Jesus," I'm going to be a little more, skeptical in that regard. And the only evidence he would have to show me is, "Hey, here's Jesus, here's a recorded conversation," and maybe I might, believe more. It's only because I haven't had any priors with a conversation with Jesus, right? So that's what you're overcoming. It's just the lack of priors, not so much it's some kind of extraordinary evidence. It's just evidence.
Well, that's actually helpful for me, Steve, because, I'm actually somewhat sympathetic, even though the tactic is used against me quite often. I'm somewhat sympathetic, at least in the scientific context, to this idea of quote unquote extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, because I see it played out quite often when people are looking to demonstrate evidence for life, let's say on Mars, or most recently, the claim that there's evidence for life in the atmosphere of Venus, right? And, the scientists, made an incredible discovery of detecting phosphine,
I have that article. I actually have that article sent to me the other day, matter of fact.
Yeah. And I mean, it's really good science, and you wouldn't expect phosphine, which is chemically unstable, to be there, at the concentrations. It's because it's an unstable material. It has to be generated in an ongoing way. And they even eliminated reasonable abiotic mechanisms. And so it's like, okay, well, the best explanation is that this is probably from a biological source. But there's still a lot of resistance to that, because that would be viewed as an extraordinary claim, or even the standard evidence that would apply in an Earth environment just doesn't seem to be acceptable when you're dealing with, the atmosphere of Venus. But your point about priors is actually helpful, because we have no prior evidence at all for life in the atmosphere of Venus. So in that case, even though that same evidence on Earth would demonstrate life in Venus, we still are skeptical or have a measure of caution about accepting the results. So that's actually helpful.
Yeah, well, I mean, for example, like we know extremophiles exist in the oceans, and by the way, that probably 100 years ago would have been just thought unheard of, right? I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, and bacteria that feed primarily on sulfur or something that is just not what we consider to be what we look at for a biological mechanism for what we consider to be life form. The whole definition of life has been changed based upon things that we discovered later on. It used to be life was basically had certain types of things like respiration, excretion, multiplication, through reproduction, but it was all based upon oxygen, correct?
Yeah.
So these other microorganisms that are completely alien, and I mean alien not as an alien life, but alien to what we have seen prior. Right. Sure, when we recognize, hey, this is something that might be living on Earth, it only has to overcome certain priors. But on another planet, we've never seen life on other planets. The priors are completely different.
Now, I mean, let's apply that to the question of God's existence, though, because I like to make the argument for design by modeling my argument after the criteria an archaeologist would use to say, well, this particular rock has been shaped by a hominin, right? And there's a set of criteria that you typically see archaeologists use to establish that. So what I like to do is apply that same criteria to biochemical systems, let's say, and draw the conclusion, well, these look like they're designed. So, I mean, in a sense, is that the same problem in terms of reasoning as an astrobiologist can be confronted with for claiming life on Venus?
That's me an astrobiologist questions I would have probably no clue in the world about. But I could probably say this. I would imagine that all the examples we have of biology are based upon RNA and DNA. Would that be correct?
Yes.
Okay, so anything that's even remotely considered to be alive has some components of either single strand RNA or DNA or double strand.
Right.
So if we're looking at something from another planet, we have actually been able to construct DNA that's not just double helical, right? We've actually been able to show different types of ways DNAs could theoretically be put together.
Yeah, all the synthetic DNAs or synthetic genetic materials are in effect double helices.
Are they? I thought they had a triple that they had maintained or something.
Oh, you might be able to make a triple helix, okay. Yeah, but I don't know if it would function as genetic material, but it may be one of these chemical oddities.
So everything we've ever experienced is really just based upon Earth terrestrial iterations, right? Because what we're based upon had to be something on prior. How it was on another planet could be completely and utterly different. But again, so we wouldn't even know what to look for as far as what gases to look for any kind of excrement or waste byproduct.
Yeah. Okay, so just to kind of bring the conversation back to this idea of applying the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence to the case for God's existence. If I'm making the same kind of argument that an archaeologist would make to say, hey, this particular artifact is indeed a stone tool that was fabricated by an intelligent agent, and I apply that criteria to biochemical systems, and I say, well, I think these systems too were fabricated by an intelligent agent for the same set of criteria. Does the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence apply? Because again, if we're dealing with issues of prior, right, I could argue, well, there's other reasons why I believe there's a mind behind everything. Or I could say, well, I'm not the first person to posit that there's a mind behind everything. So in a sense, I mean, how does that idea of priors work in that situation?
Well, I think I'm going to answer the same way most non-believers that I've seen generally answer. So I'm going to kind of put my non-believer hat on for a second. It's basically because when you had mentioned something about, hey, look, here's a rock that looks like an arrowhead. We've seen rocks that are arrowheads. We've seen humans make arrowheads. We know that is a prior. When it comes to metabolic pathways, I think in order to establish what would look like for an intelligent design agent to have designed that is what would be a metabolic pathway that isn't designed look like, and then have something to compare and contrast. Without that that ability to compare and contrast, like we would a arrowhead that we believe to be made by somebody and one that was naturally made, because when things do look like they could be naturally made, that's the whole point of teleonomic design, right? Which is apparent design that's not actually designed by some kind of intelligence. So I think we have to establish the same thing with the ecri is that we have low priors. It's not so much that extraordinary evidence is required. It's what it is we need sufficient evidence to overcome the lack of priors before to establish it to be what would be the case. And yes, I'm fine with saying here's a null hypothesis. Here's my hypothesis that I'm saying is the case. But all that means is I'm asking people to say and to evaluate what I'm trying to use as an explanation. And if I can't establish that, then you accept the null. I don't like nulls by default. They make no sense to me. When people say, hey, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence until you get that, you accept the default. That is nonsensical to me, even in science or philosophy.
So when somebody is claiming that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, in effect, they are making the null hypothesis.
Yeah,
as the default.
And that I think is the mistake that both theists and non-theists make.